my name is Dr. Katherine Weintraub. I'm the professor of saxophone at the University of South Florida and also Southeastern University. In addition, I'm also a private instructor in Tampa, Florida. Today, I will be both performing and teaching the 11th and 12th grade Alto Saxophone Allstate Etudes. I will be starting today with the technical etude, which is number 16 from the Furling book, followed by the lyrical etude, which is number 3 from the Furling book. Now here is the 11th and 12th grade Alto Saxophone technical etude. This is Furling number 16, Allegretto Risoluto. One obvious challenging aspect of this technical etude is, of course, the articulation. We see many different varieties of articulation patterns in here. One notable one is the slur-to articulation. In order to make this articulation both light and smooth, we want to keep the air moving across the articulation pattern and also use a very light tongue, so tip of the tongue on the tip of the reed. We want to try not to let the figures become choppy by breaking them up with the airstream. So for instance, we want to think dia 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 da instead of dia 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 da. Same idea goes for any other articulation pattern you will see in here, like the slur 3 tongue 1 pattern, tongue 1 slur 2 tongue 1. Dia da dia da dia da dia instead of dia da dia da dia. You want to try to keep the air moving across the articulation pattern so that way you can keep the tempo up and the tongue is going to stay nice and light. Try to make these articulations as seamless as possible, and a suggestion that I would have is to take these articulation patterns and practice them with your scales. That way you're actually taking the essence of the etude and incorporating it into your fundamental practice routine. We also want to strive to create long-range 8-bar phrases and to plan our breaths with these phrases in mind. So, there aren't many places to breathe in here, but if we can strive for making those big, long lines, I think the breaths will become rather obvious of where you can take them. You also want to exaggerate the softer dynamics, especially when it comes to the piano in the 6th line of the etude. If you can try to prolong these softer dynamics, that will also help with your breathing, because the softer you're playing, the less air you're moving, and the more you'll be able to make these long phrases. Also, in terms of phrasing, we want to strive for a sense of shaping with each line. Try to find the peak of each phrase and exaggerate it so it doesn't just sound like a technical etude. We also want it to be musically interesting. This is also a very important tip that I have, and that's to make informed decisions when it comes to the use of bis B flat or A sharp versus side B flat or A sharp. We want to make smart choices when it comes to the uses of these fingerings. Namely, try to avoid any instance of rolling with the bis key from B flat to B. We want to use side in that instance. So try to implement that idea with your scale practice. Anytime you're going from B flat or A sharp to B natural, you must be using side instead of bis. It's just too difficult to try and roll your first finger like that, and you're never going to be able to make the etude up to tempo by using that fingering in that fashion. Yet another tip that I have would be to experiment with different metronome strategies. When you're first learning the etude, perhaps think about putting the pulse on the 8th note. Dia, 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 da. And then as you get more comfortable, putting the pulse on the quarter note. Dia, 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 da. The last tip I have is surrounding the low B's in the last 2 bars. In order to get these low B's to speak, we want to think about loosening the embouchure, but just slightly with the lower lip against the reed. Try to keep the embouchure nice and firm in the corners and just increase the air down to the low B. We're often taught to drop our jaw in a very exaggerated manner to get low notes to come out, and sometimes that actually ends up hurting the response of the low notes. So see how much you can keep the embouchure intact and still get that last low B to sound. Something else that might help to get that low B to respond is just by bringing out the separation between the last 2 notes of the etude, so that way you're able to kind of prepare your airstream for that final low B. When performing this etude, you want to strive for clear yet gentle entrances to both phrases and gestures. So we don't want any air or fuzz in the sound, but we also don't want to hear an audible at the beginning of each phrase. I'm going to demonstrate what I mean just by starting the first measure. So notice that I had an immediate start to the note, but that it wasn't harsh and there was not any fuzz in my sound. Like so, you also want to strive for seamless tapers at the end of phrases. So we don't want to hear any sudden cutoffs, and we want to let the note slightly bleed into the rest at the end of a gesture or phrase. I'll demonstrate this in the second line going into the third measure. In order to perfect both of these effects, so entrances and tapers, I would suggest implementing some kind of long tone routine into your warm-up in order to have the control to execute these both gentle entrances and tapers at the end of phrases. So maybe implement some kind of long tone routine whereby you're doing some sort of crescendo and decrescendo on these long tones, so you can really get used to having the control to be able to do that. I would also recommend using vibrato to your advantage in this etude in order to further the intensity of the phrases. So wherever you feel like there's a particularly intense point, that's a good spot to put some vibrato. For instance, a really good spot to put vibrato would be going into the second line, like so. So wherever you feel like warmth or intensity is needed, that would be a good place to put some vibrato. Practice the quality of your vibrato, again with long tones, in order to achieve the appropriate width and speed that is appropriate for this etude. In terms of the ornaments, or the trills and grace notes, first practice this etude without any ornaments, just to get used to the pulse of the etude. Then, once you are really comfortable playing at a steady pulse, practice adding these trills and grace notes in but making sure that it does not interfere with the pulse of the etude or the style of the etude. So we want the trills and grace notes to have still a gracefulness and a lyricism to them, and they should not be interrupting the overall line. In some editions of the Furling book, they actually tell you exactly how many revolutions to do on a trill. For example, in the third measure, they suggest that you do a 7-tuplet followed by a 30-second figure like this. So in context, it would be. This is actually, I think, a very appropriate approach to this trill because it's not too many. The point of a trill is not to fit as many as you can into the figure, but to make it sound in context and in style. So I would, again, keep that in mind when adding these in with the metronome. You also want to make sure that your dynamics are clearly executed. A good way to do this would be to find the most intense point of the etude, or the climax, and terrace all of your other dynamics from there. So I would say that probably the most intense point of the etude would be the third line, third measure, where we go from that low B to that high F. So plan on making this your climax, and in comparison, kind of planning all of your other dynamics around that, making sure that especially your pianos are very, very soft in comparison. Lastly, I would just plan on practicing with a tuner where necessary, just to make sure that your high register isn't riding too sharp and that your low register is in tune with your high register. So just practice with a tuner just to check on these things. So those are some tips and tricks on the lyrical etude, 11th and 12th grade, alto saxophone. I hope these helped.